But look at us today. We've gone to the opposite extreme, where we have virtually no guidelines that we follow when it comes to the Sabbath. And what's the result? The result is that very few Christians today observe the fourth commandment. Very few Christians today observe a day of rest each week. So we might shake our heads at the Pharisees for coming up with all those rules for the people of their day to follow when it came to the Sabbath. But they weren't doing it to be mean. They weren't doing it to be a bunch of killjoys. No, they simply were doing what they could to help the people of their day live their lives the way that God wanted them to live. But even when people start out with the best of intentions, like the Pharisees did, it is possible to get too carried away. And that's what happened when it came to this hand washing. Because some of the Pharisees were starting to say, since we wash our hands, we are clean. We are pure in God's sight. And so if you don't wash your hands the way we do, that must mean that you are not clean, that you are not pure in God's sight. And so that must mean that you are someone who God disapproves of and rejects. Unfortunately, that's the way we quite often think even today. We figure that if God loves us, that must mean that God does not love those who are different from us in some way. Back in the 1700s, Benjamin Franklin wrote a story that many people at that time mistakenly thought was a story from the Bible. The story he called a parable against persecution. And in that story he said, once upon a time, Abraham, the great hero of the Old Testament, was visited by a man who was 198 years old. But as evening approached, Abraham discovered that that man did not have anywhere to stay. And so Abraham invited him to stay with him. About midnight, God came to Abraham and said, Abraham, where is that man who came to you? Abraham answered, Lord, as he and I were talking here this evening, I discovered that he is different from me. Lord, he says he does not believe in you and that he does not worship you and does not pray to you. And so I kicked him out of my home and drove him out into the desert. God said, Abraham, why did you do that? If I have put up with that man for 198 years, the way he is, clothing him and providing for all his needs, couldn't you have put up with him and got along with him for just one night? So often, like Abraham in that story, we feel the need to be God's little helpers. We feel that it's our job to help God out by going up to people who are different from us in some way and telling them that God disapproves of them, that God despises them. After all, we figure, if God loves us, that must mean that at the same time, God cannot love people who are different from us in some way. Doesn't that seem logical? Well, even if that might seem logical, that's not the way God works. For example, in one of the most well-known verses in all the Bible, in John 3:16, we are told that the reason that God sent Jesus was because God loves the world. In other words, God loves not just some people, but God loves all people. God loves the world. After all, in the Old Testament, the great vision that the prophet Isaiah speaks of is that day when all people from all nations will come together in one place to worship God. And in the same way, in the New Testament, the vision that we find in the book of Revelation is of that day when a vast multitude from every nation, from every race, from every language will flow together and enter into the gates of heaven. And so if that is the vision, if that is the hope that God has, then that needs to be our vision. That needs to be our hope. It's so easy to condemn people. It's so easy to denounce people. But as Christians, as disciples of Jesus, that is not what God asks us to do. Instead, our job is to reach out in love to other people, especially to those who are different from us in some way. Doing that isn't always easy. But as Christians, as disciples of Jesus, that is our mission. Let us pray. O God, author and giver of all good things, plant in our hearts the love of your name. Increase in us true religion. Nourish us with all goodness, and enable us to reach out in love